G'day, ladies and gentlemen. This is Leonard for the Ultimate Growth Experience podcast. Today, I have Dr. Don Brash today. He is the former Reserve Bank Governor from 1988 to 2002. He is the former leader of the opposition for National, former National Party leader and former ACT Party leader. He is the current chairman at ICBC New Zealand. He is the former director at ANZ National Bank Limited. He did his BA, MA in History and Politics at Canterbury University and also did his economics and PhD in ANU. He is an author, economist, former politician, lecturer and professor, and a well-known public intellectual. Dr. Brash needs no introductions. He is a famous figure in New Zealand politics, and he's one of the most respected economists in our modern era. He is also a very polarising political figure of our times. Dr. Brash, welcome to the TUGE podcast.
Thank you very much. Good to be on.
Oh, that's great. So, Dr. Brash, I heard you were a Marxist in one point in your life. So how did you go from that political perspective to your current work?
Well, I was never really fully Marxist, but I was certainly well to the left of the political centre. I was brought up in a Presbyterian manse. My father was a Christian pacifist during the Second World War. And I took it for granted that to be Christian was to be socialist, favour a big role for government, a big redistributive role for government, and that was what I just took as axiomatic. When I went to university in Canterbury, one of the economists who had a big influence on me was a guy called Wolfgang Rosenberg, who had been a refugee from Europe in the 1930s. And he was quite openly Marxist. Funny enough, he's the father of Bill Rosenberg, the economist at the CTU. A lovely guy, and he persuaded me that, again, there was a very important major role for redistribution and so on. So I was definitely left of centre. I moved from that position, I guess, for two or three reasons. First of all, my master's thesis at Canterbury University under Wolf Rosenberg was about the role of private foreign capital in New Zealand. And I wrote a thesis basically saying we should avoid using foreign capital, especially private foreign capital, because it tended to be very profitable, therefore very exploitative. And I wrote this thesis, somewhat to my embarrassment. The university regarded it as very good. Not only did they award me a first-class honours degree, but they used to publish the thing. I then went to the ANU in Australia, as you said in your intro, and intent on proving that an even much more in-depth study of foreign investment would prove just how bad foreign investment is. And I did a detailed study over 3 years of 100 American-controlled corporates in Australia, in the manufacturing sector, intent on proving how bad they were for Australia. And unfortunately, I was ambushed by reality. The fact of the matter was, it was quite clear that these companies had been of enormous benefit to Australia, except where they were the recipients of major subsidies. And the subsidies tended to be high protection against imports. So Australian consumers were paying well above the odds to buy their Australian-produced commodities, and thereby subsidising them. But in every other case, the American corporate investment was beneficial to Australia, as far as I could detect. And that study was subsequently published also by Harvard University Press. So I regard myself as an expert on foreign investment because I've written 2 books on it, one opposed to it, one in favour of it. So I've seen both sides of the argument. I then went from there to Washington, where I was working at the World Bank, and the very first major project I was involved in was in Peru. And what I saw there was how even very well-meaning government activity frequently had quite counterproductive effects. And the case I quote in my autobiography was one where the German government had given the Peruvian government money to build a hydroelectric plant in the Andes, in the high Andes mountains, because they were short of electricity. So they built this plant. And of course, when they built the plant, there was a huge amount of electricity available, and there wasn't much demand for it actually in the Andes. So they thought, what can we do to use this power? I know, we'll build a nitrogenous fertilizer plant, which requires lots of electricity. They built the thing. They thought, furthermore, that'd be good for the peasants to use this fertilizer on their land. But they didn't explain to the peasants that you don't put a huge amount of this stuff on your crop, because when you do, you kill the crops. And that's what happened. And after that, of course, the peasants wouldn't touch the stuff. So they had all this fertilizer. What did they do with it? They trucked it down from the high Andes down to the coast and then drove it hundreds of kilometres north up the coast and closed off importation of fertilizer and forced the commercial sugar plantations to use the stuff, thereby damaging the commercial viability of the sugar plantations. I mean, it was a disaster one after the other. But at every stage, there was a well-motivated intention. So it's not that the Peruvian government were bad guys, they just didn't have the incentives which you have in a market economy.
And in the words of, God, what did, I'm thinking about this, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
That's right.
That's right.
That's exactly right, yeah.
And so those facts and evidence basically debunked what you were thinking.
Move me to a strong belief in the virtues of a market economy and suspicion of government activity in many areas. Doesn't mean there's no role for government. But I mean, a classic example in New Zealand right now, people talk about the housing market, housing unaffordability, being the failure of the market. It isn't the failure of the market at all. It's a total failure of government regulation. Housing in New Zealand is grossly unaffordable, particularly in Auckland, basically for one reason. Land is ridiculously expensive. Why is that true in a country which is bigger than the UK, in area fewer than 5 million people? Because the Auckland Council has said you may not build outside this narrow area. So you pay $600,000 for tiny pieces of land. You put a tent on that, and the average wage earner can't buy it. It's beyond his capacity, or her capacity. So, I mean, it is not the failure of the market, it's the failure of government regulation which causes the housing affordability problem.
That sums up why you went from the left to the right.
That's exactly right.
And I'm currently reading a lot of books myself, so I'm quite inconclusive is my summary. So next question is, you majored in politics, history, and economics in your undergraduate degree. I'm currently doing that right now myself, exactly the same majors. So what made you personally interested in these subjects, and how did you find your passion in particularly economics?
Well, I think that again goes back to my family background. My father, as I mentioned earlier, was a Christian pacifist. He was very much preoccupied with war, causes of war, and I had done history, among other things, the cause of the First World War, cause of the Second World War. And the cause of the Second World War were a significant part, in the case of Germany, a consequence of the failure of the Allied powers after the First World War, basically saying, Germany, you caused the whole problem. Well, the Germans caused part of the problem, but there was a good deal of guilt around all sides. In the case of Japan, of course, being an island country, depends on international trade for its survival, and the Allies basically said, we're not going to trade with you, we're going to have high barriers of protection, partly prompted, of course, by the Great Depression. Japan looked around the world, saw a British Empire, French Empire, American Empire, and said, hey, we could do with one of these to sustain our viability. So they pushed, of course, into Korea and then into China, and sought to go even further. So the cause of the Second World War very much about economics, and I thought if I care about international peace, as I did, having myself registered as a conscientious objector at 18, earlier than that, at high school. I should find out how to make the world economy work better. And as I say, partly because I had registered as a conscientious objector, but wanted to go into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to make this contribution to the world, if you like, I had to make it very difficult for the ministry to turn me down. I had been probably above average student in high school, but not outstanding. But when suddenly I had my back to the wall, if you like, because I'd taken this unusual stand, I worked like a galley slave. And in fact, I was the only student in my year who finished my bachelor's degree with straight A's through all my subjects. So, and that was not to say inherent brilliance; it was absolute determination. So I was very determined.
And you still are quite determined in terms of what you're doing politically and
yeah, well,
and
you sort of get locked into a sort of modus operandi, if you like, and it colours your whole personality.
And speaking of that, I heard that you were always a workaholic. And in today's modern age, we live in an instant gratification, social media, and porn and other forms of distractions for a lot of millennials like myself. So what advice would you give to young people? So and also what made you, well, obviously you already told me why you work so hard, but...
Well, and that's the point. I mean, when you have a very strong objective, you are totally restless. You're always trying to achieve. And we were talking offline a few moments ago about ethnic groups who tend to perform exceptionally well. And it's frequently because they've been put under huge pressure at some point. And it's been true of the Jews, true of the Huguenots, true of the Quakers.
The Germans.
Indeed, many people put under pressure. They either buckle and fail, or they succeed way out of proportion to their numbers. And I guess I was someone who, having been given the benefit of a strong family background, having chosen a very abnormal sort of stance on a number of issues, it changes your personality.
And so hard work, determination,
Yeah.
self-improvement is the word that I like to use a lot, obviously.
That's right.
So speaking of that, did you have any particular intellectual hero yourself when you were growing up, besides your master supervisors and other people that influenced you intellectually?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably like yourself, I was a Keynesian, like most students of my generation. So Keynesian approach to economics is the basic way forward. And that really remained the case even quite a bit after I moved to the right. In the late 70s, about 1980 in fact, I was trying to work out how to raise the profile of the investment bank, of which I was then chief executive. And one of my competitors had brought a high-profile person to New Zealand, and I thought, how do I upstage that? And I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll invite Milton Friedman to New Zealand. It's a long shot, but I'll try. So I wrote to him asking if he would be willing to do a series of lectures in New Zealand. And to my great delight, he said, as a matter of fact, he'd be coming to Australia before very long and be happy to extend his trip to New Zealand. And the only cost to my investment bank was to show him and his wife around New Zealand for a week.
Wow.
While he did these speeches. And I read his book, Free to Choose, and found that very persuasive. And as I say, began reading some of Friedman, and that changed my view on economics.
And Hayek as well, possibly?
Not so much Hayek. Funnily enough, I gave the Hayek Memorial Lecture in London when I was governor of the Reserve Bank in about the mid-90s. And I was embarrassed to say at that point that I really hadn't read Hayek at all. I had been given a copy of The Road
to Serfdom.
Road to Serfdom,
Yes.
yeah, by Hayek, but I'd never actually read it.
That's in my reading list at the moment, and I have it in my room right now, but okay. That's interesting. So Milton Friedman was the one that pushed you as well.
And I was lucky. I mean, subsequently, I became, I won't say personal friend of Friedman, that's overstating the case, but I did have dinner at his home in San Francisco on 3 or 4 occasions.
Wow.
And as I say, met him and his wife. His wife, Rose, was also a first-class economist as well.
Oh.
And not long before they both died, they visited New Zealand when I was already in Parliament in the early part of the century, and mentioned they were stopping off in Auckland on a cruise ship. Would I have any time to see them? And I said, absolutely. And they were both 93. I thought these guys might be a bit sort of doddery and not very clear thinking at that point, but they had dinner at our home, and as sharp as razors. I mean, just a delight.
Yeah, I mean, when I watched the Hoover Institute one with Professor Sol and Peter Robinson, Sol talked about how, because for Professor Sol, Milton Friedman was his mentor as well, and how Dr. Friedman was just as smart, as sharp and healthy as you can, and so to see him suddenly go was a shock to him. So it confirms that. So speaking of your role as Reserve Bank Governor, you held the position in a period of radical economic change in the 1980s. So what was that like, and how did you really get the inflation rate down to 1 to 2%, and that weird cooperation with the government and the Reserve Bank?
Well, I was very, very lucky. I called my autobiography "Incredible Luck," and a whole lot of reasons for that. But one of them was that I met Roger Douglas through Michael Bassett, who became a personal friend when I was in Washington. He was on sabbatical visiting the US, and I met him and his wife that time. And through Michael Bassett, who was, of course, a member of the Labour Party, member of the Fourth Labour government, met Roger Douglas. In fact, I met Roger Douglas before the Fourth Labour government came into being. After that government came into office in 1984, Roger Douglas, became Minister of Finance, of course, asked me to chair the committee which designed our GST. And the New Zealand GST is widely regarded as the best GST in the world, with the possible exception of that in Singapore. And it's the best not because I was brilliant, but because Roger Douglas was willing to face down the critics in his own caucus. His instruction to me was, design the GST, or the value-added tax, which minimises compliance costs for small business. And it takes no genius at all to work out. You do that having one rate, no exceptions. And that's what our GST is. And it means you can comply with the tax very, very simply. I subsequently chaired 3 other tax committees for Roger Douglas, one on rural sector taxation, one on life insurance superannuation, and one on the accrual tax treatment of income and expenditure. I won't try and explain that. Then, of course, in 88, he appointed me to be governor. And that was an extraordinary opportunity because Roger Douglas, understood the importance of getting inflation down, and he understood the importance that was essentially a monetary policy issue. And he told the Reserve Bank, even before I became governor, focus on getting inflation down. Don't ask me about how you do it. That's your job. And in 1989, after he was no longer minister, but he certainly was the genesis of the thing which began it, we passed legislation which was world pioneering in a couple of respects, actually 3 respects. First of all, it changed the relationship between central bank and government. Prior to that act, every central bank in the world had been one of 2 kinds. They were either completely independent of government, think of the German Bundesbank, Swiss National Bank, Fed, the Reserve Board, or completely beholden to the political process. The Minister of Finance made all the key decisions, the central bank just implemented them. The Reserve Bank of New Zealand Act 1989 pioneered a totally new structure. There's an explicit role for the political process, which I think is entirely appropriate. The government decides what inflation rate the central bank should deliver and has to announce that publicly. So they put their peg in the ground, if you like, and Roger Douglas's peg was deliver inflation of 0 to 2%, excluding certain odd things like sales tax changes, etc., 0 to 2, by 1992. That's your instruction. And then the central bank is completely independent. In fact, in that act, the governor is completely independent to run monetary policy as he or she thinks fit to deliver that target, with the proviso that if he doesn't, he's out of a job. It's a typical private sector model in a sense, and the board gives the CEO an instruction, and if he doesn't deliver it without good reason, he's out of a job. The same model essentially. So that was one important thing. The second thing, of course, was that required specification of what inflation rate you would deliver, hence an inflation target. We became the first central bank in the world to embark on inflation targeting. It's now almost universal. Almost every central bank in the world has an announced inflation target. Not all central banks have that relationship between government and central bank, but quite a number do. Australia copied the model, Canada's copied it, UK copied it, Sweden copied it. I think Israel copied it, I'm not sure about that, but certainly at least 4 countries copied the model, where there's an explicit political involvement in the targeting process. And I think that's entirely proper. How fast you want your currency to depreciate, which is what the inflation thing is about, is an inherently political decision. It shouldn't be made by a bureaucrat. But delivering that inflation rate is a technical judgment and is appropriately done by bureaucrats. So it was a great model. The third thing, actually, which is unusual, and most people are not even aware of it, central banks enjoy what's called seigniorage income, which you may or may not know about.
Never heard of that one.
No. Well, only central banks have it.
Ah.
Central banks issue bits of paper, or in our case, little bits of plastic, call it money, and they sell these bits of paper or bits of plastic to the public for value. When I was leaving the Reserve Bank, I think we had about $3 billion in cash on issue. We take that value, invest it in government bonds, which most central banks do, and of course that generates huge income. They have no offsetting liabilities. We're not paying interest on banknotes. So we have, when I was there, government bond rate, so when I was leaving, was about 6%. 3 billion times 6% is $180 million a year. Well, it takes real ingenuity to spend that amount of money on staff and premises and so on. But most central banks have that seigniorage income, and you'll find that while the public sector tends to be less efficient than the private sector in general, central banks are the least efficient parts of the public sector. Why? Because they have all the seigniorage income and no accountability for it. They give whatever's left over, typically, to the Treasury as a dividend, but they get first crack at the seigniorage income. The Reserve Bank Act 89 said, no, the seigniorage income belongs to the Crown, belongs to the Treasury, not to the Reserve Bank, and you have to negotiate with the Minister of Finance for money for bread and rations to run the central bank. And we agreed to make these 5-year contracts because 1 year at a time means a huge political pressure potentially on the central bank, and we just effectively made the central bank more independent. So we 5-year contract. And the first contract I negotiated was with David Cagle, who was the Minister of Finance after Roger Douglas and before the government changed. And David Cagle said to me, "What's your budget for this year?" I said, $56.7 million. He said, "Okay, I'll let you grow that at 1% a year for 5 years." I said, "David, inflation rate's still running at 5 or 6% at this point. We're not due to get to 1% or between 0 and 2, 1 being the median, of course, until 1992. That's 2 or 3 years away." He said, "No, but 0 to 2 is your target, 1% is the median. I think you should leave it at 1% per annum increase at $56.7 million. Unfortunately for me, before the Parliament ratified that deal, the government changed. And in comes Ruth Richardson, the Minister of Finance of the National Government. Yeah. Now, Ruth and I had been friends for a decade because we both stood for the National Party back in 1981. But that didn't influence her negotiation on me at all. She said, "No, I can't give you any increase at all for 5 years." I said, "Ruth," she's not giving government departments no increase. I said, "Yes, but that's 1 year at a time. This is a 5-year contract." She said, "You believe in price stability?" I said, "Yep, I do." "Well, okay, no increase." And it's a source of embarrassment rather than pride that in the 5th year of that 5-year contract, we underspent the limit by 38%.
Wow.
Which meant there was just an enormous amount of fat in the system. And I thought I'd already reduced some of the inefficiency in my first couple of years as governor before this new regime came into force, but clearly there was a lot more. And I could give you lots of anecdotes about that.
And after Ruth Richardson, a couple of years later, you had to work with Winston Peters.
Well, I worked under, in fact, 7 ministers in total.
Ministers.
Well, David Cagle,
Yes.
Ruth Richardson, Bill Birch,
Oh, yeah.
Winston Peters,
Michael Cullen.
Bill English. Oh, of course, right, the dates at the very beginning.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. So 7 ministers in total. Yeah.
Who was the most hard to work with out of those 6 or 7?
I tell you what, that's impossible to answer.
It's impossible to answer.
Yeah, 6 of the 7 worked like galley slaves. Worked very hard. Bill Birch worked very hard, but they all worked very hard. Yep.
So speaking of economics, I just want to hear your views about the global financial crisis of 2008, because there's a lot of left-wingers that talk about it's the failure of the markets, the Wall Street, etc. Whereas Professor Solom in his book Housing Boost, Boom and Bust, he said that it's due to the ease of consumers getting unaffordable houses with subprime mortgages. I mean, what are your thoughts on what happened there?
Yeah, I'm with Thomas Sowell. There was very strong pressure on the banks to make loans to essentially uncreditworthy customers. The banks certainly misbehaved in terms of securitizing the stuff and not explaining fully what the risks were. They may not have even fully understood the risks themselves, as the rating agencies clearly didn't.
AAA.
That's right. So there was failure on all sides, including, I think, in particular, on government regulation. It's a fascinating book, name of which I can't remember for the moment, written by an economist at the Philadelphia Fed. I think it's called Great Recession, Market Failure or Policy Failure. And again, he argues that it was very much policy failure. And one of the policy failures was that the banks, far from being totally unregulated, were highly regulated. And he said not since 1984, when Continental Illinois Bank failed and all the creditors are fully bailed out, there's been no major financial failure in the United States, but bank failure or insurance company failure, where the creditors haven't been fully bailed out. So the public came to believe that the public sector had all the things under control, there was no risk. The bank directors themselves thought, everything was going to be hunky-dory, the system was tightly regulated, and they became more and more highly leveraged because of this assumption, which became very widespread, that any major that's right. That any major financial institution would be bailed out. Despite central banks always saying no bank's too big to fail, the reality was any big bank was bailed out, and unsurprisingly, people adjusted their behaviour to that. So I'm with Thomas Sowell. The myth that banks weren't regulated before 2008 is just absolute baloney.
And so, moving on to your political career after your Reserve Bank, you were the leader of the opposition, and you helped the National Party achieve one of the highest party votes in that modern era, where you were very, very close to getting a government. I'm sure there are a lot of people listening to this podcast wondering how you felt about your time in that period, and what was it like to lead people in the likes of Bill English, John Key, Jerry Brownlee?
Again, I was lucky. I came into office in 2002 when National had the worst result in its entire 70-year history at that point. We got a 20.9% of the party vote, and we're down to 27 MPs in Parliament, which had one benefit, important benefit for me, because no one else wanted the finance role. And I wanted the finance role very badly. I wanted to be the finance minister in the Bill English-led national government. Unfortunately, of course, National was continuing to poll below 30% well into 2003, and media speculation began who was going to succeed Bill English, because he wasn't going to make it. That was the media perception. And the three names discussed were Jerry Brownlee, Simon Power, and me. And I was sort of dumbfounded by this, because I really hadn't expected even remotely to be content in that sort of potential situation. Anyway, cut a long story short, I did, of course, challenge Bill. I won the caucus vote. I suspect very narrowly. I don't know what the outcome was, but I suspect it was very tight. Bill English certainly had expected to win. His numbers person had expected Bill to win. And of course, the rest in a sense is history. Many people blame me for, or credit me, depending on their point of view, of lifting National's poll support by my so-called Orewa speech. I actually gave 4 speeches to the Orewa Rotary Club in successive Januaries. Only one is ever referred to. It was the one in 2004.
Yeah.
But I mean, as I said in my speech to Massey University a few weeks ago, I was stunned by the reaction to it. I wasn't expecting the reaction at all. Why? Because every single policy proposal in that speech, Bill English had announced previously. There was no new policy in it at all. Bill had committed the next national government to scrapping separate Maori electorates. Bill had given a speech in 2002 in which he stressed that the treaty was a very important document, Treaty Waitangi, and it basically said that all New Zealanders were equal. And he was stressing, laying that on with a trowel. And I basically said the same thing. So why it suddenly elevated me enormously, Colmar Brunton, which of course does the TV1 polls,
Yes.
were so startled by the result that they redid the poll. They thought they must have made a mistake somewhere.
No error.
Because we jumped from 28 to 45 between two polls, and the following month we were up to 49. And I was leading Helen Clark as preferred Prime Minister. Now, leaders of the opposition almost never lead the Prime Minister as preferred Prime Minister. So it had a dramatic effect. Now, over the next 18 months or so, we announced other policy, crime, welfare, etc. And our polls went up and down. We thought we needed 45% to win the election. As early counting was done, we were polling 45%. We thought, hallelujah, we've won. And I prepared speech A. And as time went on, we drifted down. Mike Williams, who was president of the Labour Party at the time, said, wait till the South Auckland electorates come in with their party vote.
Yeah.
And that's what happened. We drifted down. We finally got 39.1. That was the best vote which National got to that point since 1990. The best under the MMP era. In fact, a slightly better share of the vote than National got in 1993 in the first past the post. But of course less than National got in subsequent elections under John Key. I couldn't see how I could form a government at that point. Helen Clark got 41%. And it was Rodney Hyde, leader of the ACT Party, who said, look, why didn't you form a government? And I said, how do you do that? I've got 48 MPs, I need 61. He said, well, ACT has got 2, that's 50. United Future's got 3, that's 53. The Maori Party's got 4, that's 57. I said, what do you mean the Maori Party? He said, no, the Maori Party would prefer to be in bed with National than with Labour. Tariana Turia was brought up in a national voting household and would prefer to be in bed with you than with Helen Clark. And we talked to the Maori Party, and they said, yeah. So Helen Clark also had 57 votes. She had 50 Labour, Jim Anderton won, 6 Greens, 57. So we each had 57. And Winston Peters held the other 7. And he was doing what he did, of course, last year.
Yeah.
Will I, won't I? And eventually jumped with Labour, of course. So it was close, but no cigar. And again, Winston made the choice.
And he's always been seen as that Machiavellian sort of manipulative sort of politician who panders to one side and the other and compromises and gets...
Well, I mean, if you were in Winston's position, that's exactly what you'd do.
That's true, yeah.
The Greens make the mistake of locking themselves into a position where they can only go with Labour, which gives all the power to New Zealand First.
Indeed. So, going back to your personal way of doing things, do you have any particular habits or micro habits you do daily? So every time I have a guest on, they tell me that, I wake up at 7 in the morning, I do this, I do that, and so...
Well,
what does Dr. Brash do?
I tend to have less of a routine now, of course, because I no longer have a sort of full-time job. The only job I'm paid for on a regular basis is being chairman of ICBC New Zealand, as you mentioned. But I get up at 6, the alarm goes at 6 o'clock every day, and that works for me because the body clock fits in with that, and normally I wake just a few minutes before the alarm goes off. Whether it's weekday or weekend, it tends to be a good routine for me, and that means I've had breakfast and showered and shaved and read the paper and cleared the email overnight before 8 o'clock, so I'm ready for the day's work.
And then after work, and then you come back and then repeat.
Right. Yeah.
Quite good. So, Dr. Brash, all of my guests have all faced adversities in their lives, and they overcame it to achieve their goals. So, did you ever have like a really low point in your life, and how did you overcome it?
Well, I guess there are 2 kinds of adversity. I mentioned earlier that I had registered as a conscientious objector when I started high school, actually. That was a turning point in my life, partly because it meant that from that point on I worked like a dog, but partly also because, having been a fairly quiet, retiring individual prior to that, I suddenly had to defend myself. I was at a high school where had a very proud military tradition. At that time, the heads of the New Zealand Air Force, Army and Navy, and I think also the Joint Chiefs of Staff, were all old boys. Very proud military tradition. And he was this idiot, Don Brash, at the age of 15, having done military cadets for the first 3 years of high school, suddenly deciding he wanted out. So I was suddenly forced to defend myself, not physically. I didn't ever get into fistfights with my friends, but I got into intense debates and arguments from people who thought I was crazy. And I suddenly, as I had to become articulate and defend my argument. So that was one low point, or pressure point anyway. I've been through two marriage breakups, and in each case, after nearly 20 years of marriage, they were very painful in both cases. I felt really, really depressed in both situations. Entirely my own fault. I'm not blaming anyone else but myself. But they made me very depressed, and they were low points.
And now you're doing relatively all right, and now fighting against the Massey University Vice Chancellor, and being
it's quite bizarre. I mean, I strongly believe in equal political rights for every citizen, irrespective of their ethnicity. To me, that's absolutely fundamental for New Zealand, but also for any well-functioning democracy. And I can, and as you know, New Zealand has a substantial number of immigrants, people born outside the country. Auckland has 40% of Aucklanders not born in New Zealand. It's a high proportion of non-native born citizens in any city in the world except Toronto and Brussels. So it's a high number of, and creating preferences based on race just strikes me as utterly bizarre and very destructive. I look at a place like Malaysia, where they created preferences for Malays. That just does not work. You've got Indian Malaysians and Chinese Malaysians leaving Malaysia, being educated overseas, often not coming back, depriving Malaysia of some very talented people because of the preference for Malays. And we're doing the same thing with Maori on a more limited scale. And I think that's a disaster. And many Maori do too. One of the MPs I got to know quite well in Parliament was a guy called Ron Mark. Now, Ron Mark is a New Zealand First MP, was deputy leader, not now, but he was. He's Maori, and he says, "Don't treat me like I can't sort of stand on my own 2 feet." He said I was elected mayor of Carterton, not because I was Maori, or despite the fact I was Maori, but because I thought I was the best person for the job. He said, when Georgina Bayer describes herself as a former transvestite Maori prostitute, can win in the general electorate of Wairarapa against Paul Henry, the National Party candidate, we no longer need separate Maori electorates. And he's right. So I utterly deplore the extent to which politically correct people have created an illusion the Treaty of Waitangi created some special political status for those with a Maori ancestor. It's nuts. It's damaging. It's damaging to Maori, damaging to New Zealand. So I believe in that particular cause very strongly indeed. And fortunately, so do a number of Maori friends.
Indeed, indeed. So, Dr. Brash, you are an individual who has achieved a lot over the years. And so, what advice would you give to university students and working professionals today? So, what could they try and do differently to get to a position of where they achieve their goals and become successful?
Well, I think you have to have something you really badly want to do. I didn't so much want to be an economist as to save the world. I exaggerate ever so slightly. But I was motivated, as I said earlier, by a strong feeling that international conflict was driven frequently by failure in economic policy. Someone said, I can't recall what it was, when goods don't cross boundaries, soldiers will. And it's why I am a very strong believer in free trade, and I utterly deplore what Donald Trump is doing. I think he's a menace to the world. So the motivation was this sort of delusion that I could actually do something substantial.
You've done a lot, though.
Well, maybe. But the key thing is to have a goal, which is more than just finishing a degree.
Which is typically the majority of university students, to be fair, unfortunately.
Well, and that's partly because I guess we've brought them up in a society where most things are provided to them. Fees free, education the first year, interest free thereafter. I mean, okay, I can't point fingers. University education was largely free when I went through, not quite free, but very largely. But if you don't have something worth achieving, it's awfully hard to get out of bed in the morning.
True that. And so do you have any advice to those aspiring to enter politics in the long run? Maybe like a young lad who's in the Young Nats or maybe in Young Labour or wherever.
Well, I think there are various ways of getting into politics, obviously. One way is to get into the system quite early and work your way up. But the danger of that is that you haven't really had much knowledge of the real world. You don't know how the world ticks. You become a young nat, you go into a research department at Parliament, you gradually get nominated, and you've never been in any world other than a political world. And I fear that too many of our politicians are in that space. Now, having said that, some of them have been very successful in doing that particular route. Others go in sort of mid-career in their 30s or early 40s. That also works for many people, and you've seen people like Bill English and others do that. Though I think Bill got in fairly early too, didn't he? He was quite young. I, by contrast, did the reverse of that. I entered Parliament when I was almost 62.
Wow.
I was turning 62 just a few months after that election. And that's relatively unusual these days in New Zealand, but in 2006, when I was still leader of the party, the media was saying that Brash will be 68 by the time the 2008 election comes around. It'd be clearly way over the hill. And I pointed out to some journalists, I said, look, John McCain is contesting the US presidential election in 2008, the same year that I was hoping to win the 2008 election here. He'll be 72. And I venture that being President of the United States is a good deal more stressful than being Prime Minister of New Zealand. But so we've got this hang-up that you really have to be sort of in your 30s or 40s to sort of do a proper job in politics. Maybe you can do that, and Jacinda will be a proof or otherwise of that particular proposition. But these days, a person in their 60s is still, normally at least, physically and mentally fully alert. And there's no good reason why a person in their 60s can't make a perfectly good Prime Minister.
Indeed, and Bernie Sanders himself was 75 when he ran for the Democratic election as well.
Donald Trump's in his 70s.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
I'm not quite sure how old Hillary was or is, but she's getting on that way too.
Indeed. So, final question for today. Do you have a social media account or something that my followers could follow you on?
Well,
you're well known already. But
yeah, I've got a Twitter account, a Twitter handle. I've got a Facebook page. To be honest, I don't use either of them very much. And that's mainly because I find Facebook, where I occasionally post some sort of thought pieces, I made the mistake of posting an article by an Otago writer about his resenting the use of Te Reo Maori on English language Radio New Zealand programs. And I happen to agree with that. It irritates the hell out of me that 100% of people who listen to RNZ understand English. Maybe 3% understand Maori. But it's virtuous signalling by Radio New Zealand. They've got to have lots and lots of Maori language, which I don't understand. And I suspect the great majority of New Zealanders don't understand. And I didn't write the article, but I reposted an article which he had written.
And you got a lot of publicity about that.
Absolutely. And I tend to post something which is political opinion. And by definition, that brings out the trolls and the abusive stuff.
That's the online media.
That's right.
I disagree with that premise, but that's totally fine. We agree to disagree.
That's right.
So anyway, Dr. Brash, thank you very much for your time. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you soon. Ka pai. See you later.